Mark, thanks for being on the show, my friend.
Jimmy, it's my pleasure to be here.
You know, it's such an interesting, such an important topic that you cover and you talk about quite often, and we'll kind of get into your story here in a second. But, you know, I have multiple situations where I've had friends that have been suicidal. And a couple, you kind of know they're, suffering with a little bit of depression or got some things they're going through. And other times you have no idea. And lost two friends at the beginning of the pandemic to suicide. And so it's a topic that I came out with my book a couple months ago, and I have 4 or 5 pages about this topic. But when I listen to your TED Talk and hear you speak and speak about this, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about suicide and people that are in that phase. And so I want to have you on where we can kind of lean into that a little bit and talk about some of these things. But I'd love to start out with your story. I know you probably have told it a million times. It was such a powerful story. And so if you would maybe start from that, and we'll kind of go from there.
Sure. Everything that I do now professionally and personally, I base in my own lived experience. Growing up as a little kid in a small town, being forced to feel like I needed to grow up a lot faster, to be a man, as my stepfather always told me, especially if he detected any kind of weakness or kind of fluffiness that he might have detected in me, and he had all his own stuff going on as well. But to be constantly reminded of this idea that I needed to grow up, I needed to suck it up, I needed to hide how I was feeling, it very quickly had a negative impact on me, because I was a kid and I am now a man who feels big things, and I wear my heart on my sleeve. And I think it's really it's one of my greatest strengths now, I thankfully realize, because it makes me so creative and engaged in my life. But back then, I didn't really have any positive male role models to show me that it was okay to be that kind of person, to have an active emotional life. So, it turns out when you hold all that energy, all of that eros or pathos or whatever you want to call it inside you, it's going to find a way to come out. And in my case, as is the case for far too many men and boys and everybody, it came out in incredibly unhelpful ways. So I started thinking about suicide probably as young as about 9 or 10 years old, maybe
Wow.
even younger, actually. And I think it's just because it became so normal to me. I didn't, you can't see the world through anybody else's eyes or through anybody else's mind. So you only know the world through the way that you know it. And for me, it was that I didn't know how to deal with this stuff myself. So I started thinking about how I could escape it. And we didn't talk about suicide or mental health challenges at that time. So that really started to iterate itself through my elementary school years, and when I made the transition into middle school, that's when everything fell apart.
So you were just dealing with those thoughts. Just even as a young
100%.
child. I'm not sure the exact stats. Maybe you're familiar, but I think that's the number of kids that do think about suicide at under age 12 years old is staggering. The number versus where it used to be several years ago.
Yeah, and actually, people don't understandably ever want to think about the tragedy that is the fact that kids under 10 die by suicide, more than you would think. And it's for this reason that we really don't talk about it. But it fell apart for me when I made that transition to middle school, I think, because, and I only realized this much later on, even when you're suicidal, maybe especially when you're suicidal, you rely on your habits. You rely on your familiarity, your relationships that are all around you. And then when all that gets ripped away and it changes, that's ground zero for watching out for risk factors that, maybe that person actually doesn't have coping mechanisms, that they've been relying on habit to just get through the day. And that applies to kids too. So that's why I think we need to really pay attention to kids at these transition times when they realize that maybe there's not a whole lot of skill underneath all that habit to really take care of themselves. And that's what happened to me.
So for you at that time, then was this a daily battle? Was it just kind of started perpetuating on top of itself, or what was the experience for you?
So things escalated very quickly for me after that. After that transition to middle school, I was referred to my high school guidance counselor because or my middle school guidance counselor rather, because I was late for a test one day. And I started doodling in the margins, just drawing little pictures in the margins of this test. I only had 10 minutes left to finish it. It was, I think, a social studies test or something. And I was late because I was fighting with my stepfather all morning, and I missed the bus because of that. That became a very recurring occurrence. But all that I could manage to do was draw these little pictures in the margins of my test of 10 different ways that I could end my life. And that was the first time that all these thoughts that had been swirling within the confines of my head made it into the outside world. So my teacher saw them. She sent me down to the guidance counselor, who didn't know what to do. I mean, guidance counselors still don't really get a lot of training on suicide prevention.
My understanding is that they tell them not to try to save much because they don't want to have liability. Like they almost teach them not to do anything about it.
They very often do, and very often they're just too afraid, and then they'll say something like, "I'm not a counselor, I'm not a therapist." Right. There is so much more. While that's true, of course, you wouldn't expect them to do clinical type interventions. There is so much more they can be doing to be gatekeepers to help build resilience. So, that was the first time that I was sent off to the hospital, to the emergency room. I was admitted to the psychiatric ward in my little hometown, which was not specialized for children and youth, I should add. So I'm surrounded by a bunch of adults with wildly different psychiatric histories for a few days. And then over the next couple of years, I was in and out of that psych ward half a dozen times with just the crisis kept coming back. They'd get me in, stabilize me, put me on different medications, release me back out into the world, into the wild, and nothing changes if nothing changes. So I just kept bouncing in and out of that system for years.
So what could have, I guess, before we go into kind of what happened next, what could have been helpful for you looking back? I know you've studied this a lot now and everything, or what could have been some of the different things or modalities they could have used to help in that situation?
Well, the best time to prevent a crisis is before it happens. And people don't realize that, to go to the next closest level back, or to work back from that feeling suicidal, getting stuck in that suicidal sort of mindset. One step back from that was the depression and the anxiety that I was dealing with. Depression intervention is suicide prevention. We know that not all cases, not all deaths by suicide or even suicide attempts are necessarily linked to mental illness and depression, but a pretty significant chunk of them are. In fact, by some analyses, the majority are. So if you want to prevent a good number of suicides, intervene earlier in depression. But I would actually suggest you go even further back than that. We can prevent depression by teaching kids how to name and label their emotions. Dr. Daniel Siegel says all the time, he's become famous for saying, name it to tame it. You can't deal with something that you don't know what it is, that you don't acknowledge it, that you don't have the skills for how to manage it. So, teaching kids how to recognize sadness in themselves, what to call that, and then what to do with that. You follow that pathway down, and that's another very effective way to preventing suicide. So I think if people had have helped me from that earlier on, having constructive conversations about that it's okay to feel feelings, not just as a boy, but as a human, and that you could do something with it, that would have helped certainly to curb a lot of my tendencies later.
Yeah, I talk about this in my book as well, where I say, look, the goal is not to feel better, it's to feel more, right? It's like to let those feelings through, to let them pass through. I had somebody text me this morning, and he's, for the first time in decades, he's experiencing his feelings and he's not really sure what to do with it. I'm actually going to read it to you real quick because I'd love your advice as far as what to tell him. He literally texted me this morning, and he basically said, here, because the way that he said it was really, he said, how do I sit through an emotion? I feel like my wife has been distant lately. As a result, I feel lonely. This is one of the emotions that has triggered my urges to watch porn. I understand that this is the emotion, but how do I let the emotion ride? Am I supposed to endure it, or will it eventually just go away? So I'd love to hear how you, because he's just now letting himself feel these feelings. He's always just suppressed them with porn and other things, right? And so so I'd love your take on that.
I think that there's two elements to this, at least two. There's the individual piece of it, his feelings, and then there's the relational dynamic between he and his wife. I think, in order to be in good, healthy, productive relationships, we have to look at ourselves first and our own stuff. So in that respect, we a whole generation, maybe more, multiple generations of people have been raised on the idea that it's not okay to not feel okay, when in fact, distress tolerance, or whatever else you want to call it, sitting with discomfort, is actually one of the most productive skills that we can learn how to do. And I'm so grateful to my mindfulness practice in particular with this, because I know this isn't for everybody, but just to use it as an example, when you're sitting on a cushion for sometimes 45 minutes or an hour at a time, your legs hurt. As I'm getting older now, so my knees are creaky and my ankles hurt and your back starts to hurt after a while. And then part of it, I was raised Irish Catholic, maybe that might be part of it too, where you kind of get used to the whole idea of redemptive suffering and all this stuff, and that suffering can be good. That's not entirely what this is, but it's the idea that you can ride it out. It's not about white knuckling it. That's a very different thing, or about suppressing your emotion. It's about sitting with discomfort and saying, this is uncomfortable, and that's okay. I think that's a really important skill to learn how, because what you'll notice, especially when it comes to mental health crises, is that they do come in waves, that it comes up, it peaks, and then it falls. Anybody who's listening and again, I'll go in a lot of different obscure and tangential directions, I'm sure, but anybody who's ever taken a psychedelic trip knows how to avoid a bad trip by not clinging to it too tightly. You let it ride through. That's how it happens. So, I think that this is good advice for dealing with negative emotions. The other half of this, though, is the relational dynamic. Getting into your own place where you can own your own difficult emotions is important, but then have that conversation with somebody else too. Be two people who are working on yourselves together. And you'll notice pretty quickly, I think, that assuming both parties are willing to do that, it reignites that sense of connection, because you're sharing something vulnerable about yourself with somebody else. You're not just defending, you're confronting it. You're having productive conversations that build connection. So, it's the process, I think, of being vulnerable, of sharing your vulnerability, of getting better together that helps to build solid relationships that combat loneliness. So I think that's the two sides of this, is getting comfortable with yourself and your own discomfort, but also sharing that discomfort, what you need, transparently, openly, constructively, with the people who mean the most to you.
When I like that you put it in the sense of it's like almost like a skill you learn. And that's what I told him. I said, just go sit alone for an hour. Don't judge anything that comes up. Just be with it. Like, absolutely. I think where we get in trouble is where we try to solve it, we try to fix it, we try to understand it. It's like, no, just sit with it. Like, you truly do just have to sit there. You don't have to do anything else other than just let it come through.
I think of that, and this happens both, we do this to ourselves, but we try to do it to other people too. And I call it fixer fixation. This idea that it's not okay to be that way, so we're going to fix this, we're going to make it all go away. And I think actually that's been really what has underpinned the problem with our modern mental health care system, which is that it's almost entirely built on this eliminative approach of how do we make these bad feelings go away.
Yeah, drugs should be the last resort, right?
And they can serve a function for a lot of people. I think we've kind of fallen for the message that they're the only way, or that it's the right way, and that's not necessarily true. They don't work for everybody. Actually, in fact, they don't even work for a majority of people. So sometimes we can feel guilt over that. We try that antidepressant, or we try 5 of them, and none of them works. So then we think, well, maybe that means I'm unhelpable, or I'm unfixable. Maybe that means there's something wrong with me. No, it doesn't. Maybe it just means that meds don't work for you, and that's okay. We can find new ways to get better. So I'm of the view that we should never close off any pathway to recovery, because you can show me 10 different people, all with the same diagnosis of depression, and they're going to show me 10 different ways to be depressed. So that means then there's got to be 10 different ways to recover. This is incredibly individual.
So how much of depression comes from, people actually having a chemical depression problem versus how many people just aren't taking care of themselves? That's a question that I always ask.
It's a really good question. And what the most recent research shows us, although there are people who would disagree with when we found this out. Some people think it was very recent. Other people will say it's been a long time that we've known this. The so-called chemical imbalance theory was never more than a hypothesis, and it's never been proven. In fact, it's been routinely disproven. There is no chemical imbalance. This is going to make some people uncomfortable. There is no chemical imbalance that's ever been proven in depression. The so-called serotonin deficiency hypothesis is largely false. And that doesn't seem to be how antidepressant medications or other psychiatric medications work, by increasing your levels of depression in your of serotonin rather in your brain, and that's what alleviates your depression. So there's lots of good research to suggest that you can't even say that it's been debunked because it was never proven to begin with. So where does that leave us? Where do we go from here? A significant amount of what leads people to depression are psychosocial factors. We know that. We've known that for a very long time. We know that psychotherapy, structured psychotherapy, evidence-based psychotherapy, does tend to work better than medications do, especially in the long term, for long-term recovery from depression. And when you think about psychotherapy, if you don't know a lot about it, essentially what it is learning. It's training in many ways. It's unpacking problematic coping mechanisms and relational or attachment styles that are holding you back. So that fundamentally is psychological and social in nature. It's relearning how to be a person in the world. Again, I don't want to discount the biomedical approach here. It has contributed a lot. I've studied myself a lot in that space, and there were times in my life when medication did serve a limited and focused function. But if you're waiting for a medicine to cure you, you're going to be waiting an awfully long time, because that's not the only piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, no, I like the way that you put that, as far as like learning to live a different way, essentially, like just learning to react differently, learning to tell ourselves a different story about what things mean, right? You change the meaning, you change the way you feel, and all of a sudden you can start to really revamp the way that you react to all these different memories and emotions and things that you have.
Mm-hmm. And we get so stuck in our stories, I find. I mean, this has been my experience too. When I wrote my book, my memoir, So-Called Normal, I thought that I had dealt with all my stuff, and I thought this before I did the TED Talk as well. Oh, I'm good now, I'm in a good place where I can say this. And then I go and do it. I crack myself open in order to access all of that rich, creative, emotional material that's inside me. And I realize, oh, crap. I don't know if I could swear on your show, but sure. I'm self-censoring. Oh, crap. I got a lot of stuff going on in there. And that's what I found out unexpectedly, for some reason, when I wrote my book. It was that I realized very early on in that creative process that I had all this stuff just bubbling up right beneath the surface of my skin. And that as I let it all come up, and then understanding that as the writer Anne Lamott famously says about shitty first drafts, just let yourself write a shitty first draft, get it all out there on the page, the material to work with, and you can fix it and edit it later. You can put it all and make it make sense later. That was incredibly therapeutic for me, to be able to get all that emotion, all that experience out of my head and realize, oh, I actually own this. And the story that I tell myself about my life is the most healing and therapeutic thing that I can do for myself, because I get to assemble this in my own head however I want. That was a revelation for me, and writing that freed me in many ways, not the least of which from the grief that I had been carrying, but the trauma of my childhood.
Yeah. Well, you came to a breaking point. If you would maybe tell the story where the day that you had decided you were going to go ahead and take your life, with the bridge and everything.
Yeah. So I'd been in and out of hospital half a dozen times. I'd been on a dozen different medications in different combinations and cocktails. You get prescribed, especially if you get a lot of inpatient psychiatric care, you get prescribed sometimes medications to treat the side effects of other medications, and just all sorts of combinations. I felt like I was one of those broken people who had we tried so hard to fix me, and I was just a broken down car on the side of the road, and all these really smart people, all these doctors couldn't fix me. So I was hopeless. I was just one of those hopeless cases. There's a few of them you hear, and I hear about this from people all the time. Maybe I'm not one of those people who can recover. Maybe I'm one of that, less than 1% who is just going to have this for the rest of my life and it's never going to get any better. I didn't want to be that way. So I had been developing a plan, and we know that it immediately increases risk if somebody expresses suicidality and they have a plan. But then the more times they attempt, that increases the risk further, because just like we learn how to recover, we learn new skills for how to get better. We learn the opposite stuff too. People aren't born knowing how to kill themselves. The more times you start to attempt, it increases risk because you're learning how to do it. You're building a cognitive pathway toward that eventual end. So that's what I'd been doing, I think, unconsciously and then consciously or explicitly for years, in fact. So after what I came to think of as another trivial trigger, because when you're primed for anything to push you over the edge, you're just looking for something to, I think, to pull that trigger. So for me, it was another crisis. I think, a girlfriend issue or something, a breakup, a conflict, interpersonal conflict was always a big trigger for me. And I went to a bridge in my hometown that was stretched over a mostly abandoned steel plant at that time. And I later figured out that I went to that place because that location was significant to me. And this is what the research tells us too, that suicide hotspots and places where people go to die, they're not random by and large. They hold personal significance to people. And I think I went there because when I looked at that abandoned steel plant, where once my whole great big Irish Catholic family made their livelihood, but here it was abandoned and one of the worst toxic waste sites in North America, I looked at that place and it was exactly how I felt inside. I felt abandoned and toxic and useless and, a blight on society. So I went there and I climbed over the railing of that bridge and I stood there for what must have been forever. I mean, time does funny things in your head when you're in this kind of place. But I stood there, I think, sort of captured by the power, by the control that I finally felt like I had over my life. The decision of whether or not I was alive was entirely in my control. And I think that ultimately is what I was seeking. I was seeking agency. I needed some say in my life, in my own mind. And as I stood there in that place, the thing that sort of snapped me out of that cyclical kind of lock in my thoughts was a man's voice over my shoulder. And he came up behind me. He said, I grew up on the East Coast. They have a famously recognizable accent, similar to Maine or maybe Boston to a degree. But he comes up behind me. He says, "You don't look like you're doing so good there." and it just snapped me out of this place that I was in my mind. And I immediately felt this collapse that had kept me so tight start to expand a little bit as I realized that there was a person there. And that man, he stood nearby, not very close to me, certainly not close enough to grab me, and he just talked to me. He didn't rush forward. He didn't tell me what I was doing was stupid or wrong or evil or any of these things. He didn't say I was sick or crazy, because I'd heard all of those things before.
Yeah.
He didn't ask me about my diagnoses or anything like that. He just talked to me and got to know me. And as he did, it's like I felt my mind start to relax out of this place that it had been in. That was until some people that had gathered on the sidelines, the cops had arrived, they barricaded the bridge, crowds had started to gather. You grow up in a small town and it's so friggin' boring half the time that people listen to the police scanner, the radio, to see if there's any action, even though it's midnight on a Sunday night in March. So all these people come out and this group of young guys on the sidelines shout out to me to jump.
Oh, geez.
And they call me a coward. I'll remember it like it was yesterday. And that's when it was like an underwater explosion. When he told me to jump, when he shouted out for me to jump, it was like everything else just collapsed back in again. All this spaciousness that this stranger had been introducing just disappeared, evaporated. So I let go of the railing and I started to fall. But fortunately, that stranger, who I could only see was wearing a light brown jacket. I couldn't see anything else about him. It was too dark and he was behind me. So when I could turn and see, I could only see that he had this light brown jacket on. I saw his arm wrap around my chest and he grabbed me, he pulled me back and he saved my life. And it was one of those moments where my memory then just sort of stops from there. It just, it was such a traumatic experience for me in so many ways that I know I was loaded into the ambulance and sent back off to the hospital again. But that was it, at least for that time being, that man reached out and saved my life and pulled me off that bridge. And I had to go on with the rest of my life.
So from that point forward, how did you get help to make sure that, you never attempted again?
I wish I could say no. I'm going to correct that before I even say it. There was a time in my life when I would have wished that I suddenly had a hallelujah, come to Jesus kind of moment and realized the error of my ways and suddenly was cured. I think that's what a lot of people who deal with depression and suicidal thinking and attempts, what they want for themselves is just to feel better. That didn't happen for me. I was discharged from the hospital 24 hours later because by that point I'd become what's known disparagingly in the healthcare system as a frequent flyer, an attention seeker, right? Somebody for whom the more help they need, the less help they get. I was discharged. They sent me home in a cab. And I remember learning that it was the first day of spring. And later found out, or later realized, I guess, that was the last time that I'd be admitted to a psychiatric ward for a suicide attempt. And I think what happened, and I didn't realize this until more than a decade later, in fact, I think what happened was that I fixated on this image of these two men who were with me on that bridge that night. There was this stranger in the light brown jacket who talked to me, who introduced all this spaciousness, and this other stranger at the barricades on the sidelines who just shouted out for me to jump. And I think something in me just identified with the stranger in the light brown jacket who reached out and who got to know me and who took that brave step of being compassionate. And I think identifying with him, I wanted to be like him. And that's really what drove me forward. I ended up talking not long after that, wanting to talk to my peers. I was in high school by that time about my experiences. And the high school principal said, no, that you can't talk about suicide because it gives people the idea to go out and do it. That's false, by the way. This has been studied over and over again. Talking about suicide, when done well especially, but talking about suicide is the most effective way to prevent it because it doesn't put the idea in people's heads. It gives them the permission to say that they were already thinking about it. So I knew that even at the time. We've had this research for decades. So I went home and I wrote a letter to my local newspaper, which was published the next morning. There were television news cameras in the principal's office asking why it wasn't okay to talk about mental health in school. And suddenly, I didn't feel so alone anymore. And I wasn't ostracized because of it either. People started coming to me and telling me that they had struggled too. It's like everybody was out there just struggling in silence with the same issues. Yeah, and they didn't know that they were in the same room together.
One of the exercises I do with my men's group, we'll get 50 of us together, and I do this exercise where if whatever I say relates to you, you step inside the circle to be seen. And one of the questions I ask is if you woke up thinking today might be your last day, or if you've ever woke up thinking today was your last day, step into the circle. And there's always a dozen guys that step into the circle. And all of a sudden the tears start flowing because it's the guy to your right and the guy to your left and these people that you had no idea that they'd been suffering like that. And it really opens up a container for people to be able to talk about what's really going on and just the awareness that there's other people that are having the same struggle as you seems to be the most helpful thing for them to be able to work through it.
Absolutely. I think that's what takes down the barriers. But that said, though, and I think this is important, awareness is the first step. Because when it's all behind the scenes being held in, all that stuff, but it can't be seen as the only step or the last step. Awareness is it opens the door for you to do the work. And that's where I think we still have a long way to go in public mental health awareness. We've done a lot of awareness in just the last 10 years. To think about now, the number of celebrities, musicians, actors, sports heroes who talk about mental health, way more now than there were even just 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. But I think where we're still failing is that you can go to a psychiatric ward or go to your doctor or go to a school and ask for help, and not much has changed yet on that side of the equation.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you.
So I think that's where we still do need to do more.
Yeah, so if you are feeling suicidal, you have a friend that is, like, what are the steps to help it right now?
Well, I don't want to either discount the importance of awareness and acknowledgement, because that still is incredibly important. How do you help somebody who either doesn't know they need help or who resists help? And look, we've tried that in the mental health space for a very long time. We've tried to inject recovery into people or to strap them down until they're not depressed anymore. It doesn't work. In fact, it's the opposite. It's counterproductive. So then how do we actually meet people where they are and gently guide them, shepherd them, prepare the way for them to recover? I think that's what we need to focus on. Mm-hmm. It's so easy if you're a best friend or a partner or a sibling, a coworker, to fall into that trap of fixer fixation where you just want people to get better and skip all the work part that it takes to get there. People don't realize that being a good friend to somebody is something that prepares the way for recovery. You don't always have to talk to them about their problems. Especially if you've been suffering for a long time, you've probably had a lot of people who've asked you about everything that's wrong with you and all your problems. Maybe just ask me to go to a movie or go to a football game or have a phone conversation or something else for a change. Don't discount the power of those relationships. These are the ties that bind us to the world. These having people who care about us, and that if we want to talk about our problems and what we're struggling with and what we're suffering with, especially as guys, having those secure relationships is what predisposes us to do that first. And sometimes we don't even need to. For anybody who's been in a long-term relationship, you probably can relate to this. Eventually, I think you get to a point when you're in your relationship where you can just sit next to each other on the sofa, watching a movie or not, reading books, whatever. You don't even have to say anything. Mm-hmm. You're just happy to be there, and you can still feel connected in those spaces where nothing is really said because it doesn't have to be. That's a beautiful place to get to as well, and that has healing power to it too. So I guess I would say, don't be so basic about it where you think that you got to get that person to the doctor, to a therapist, on medication, whatever. They might very well need all those things or any of those things, but that's only going to happen within the context of trusting deep relationships with somebody that they know and feel cares about them.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. A lot of times being a coach, I was with a friend one time and he'd had suicidal thoughts for quite a while, and we were talking one night and it was a really good lesson for me. And at one point he stopped me and he goes, "Hey man, just need you to be my friend tonight. I really don't need you to coach me." And I was like, shit, you know what I mean? It's just like, oh, that's so, yeah. And that's what it was. And it's like, I kind of learned a little bit more of like, hey, maybe that's the role I can play here, is I don't have to, because in my buddy that I talked to about this, he said the problem is, he said, you can tell that people are uncomfortable with it. So if you can be comfortable with their situation, that's a good start. Just be comfortable with them being depressed. Yep. You don't have to be awkward about it. You don't have to, he said, people are so afraid of, like, they want to make sure that you heal so that it's like not on their hands kind of thing, almost like that they had a part in it. And it's like, no, man, just be a part of them. Like, just love them. Not have to feel like there's any kind of stress or pressure to be able to change them. And that's really the most powerful thing you can do as a friend, and just help them feel like they're okay not being okay.
And, many of us, I think, and people who get into helping professions, whether it's coaching or even psychology or psychiatry, psychotherapy, people who get into those professions almost invariably do so because they've got their own story. And sometimes, look, you're going to talk to even a professional and they don't have all their own stuff worked out yet either. I mean, ideally, they're doing their own coaching, they have their own therapist, whatever, too, because they don't have to be experts, but ideally they know a little bit more about the process than you do, or at least are willing to walk with you together if you're at the same level. Although that said, I'll even qualify that. I've learned more about life from my kids and from other people who weren't actively trying to teach me anything, but that I was receptive to it and open to it. That's a beautiful thing too. But, look, I think recognizing that we're all in this together. We're all just walking each other home, as Ram Dass said. And I think entering into that reality, making it okay for other people to suffer, that they're allowed to suffer. They're entitled to their suffering. I don't have to take it away. I don't have to be their messiah and come in there and fix everything for them. But we can be in this together. And that's a incredibly brave space to enter into, I think, as a helper or as a person who needs help, because we're all always both, by the way, to be able to keep your heart open in hell. I think that's really what it's about, not to shut yourself down, not to fall into the trap of avoidance of just trying to make everything better, but rather just to sit there and say, man, this really sucks. I hate this. I wouldn't wish this on anybody. Let's ride it out together, because it will pass. It will always pass.
How do you help somebody that has self-destructive habits or behaviors, and that's the reason why they're, stay in this place where they feel broken?
Who doesn't self-destruct every now and then? I think getting in touch with it in yourself, first of all, understanding that behavior is information. Everything we do. And you can micro-analyze people down to their atoms if you want, but everything we do is a product of cause and effect. It always has been for the entire history of the universe. So I think that's where it starts, is understanding that they're not doing this necessarily to vex you or to be spiteful, or they're not even always doing it to self-destruct consciously. It's how they're trying to cope. We're all just trying to get through this together, and that's how they've learned to do it. And maybe they've fallen into a cycle where they can't get out of it, that it makes them feel worse, but it works, and it's the safety of the devil they know. So that's what they rely on. Don't underestimate the power of fear, that the power that fear has to shape our behavior, and we're afraid of the unknown. So I think entering into those relationships with people where you can encourage them to step outside of that, to embrace the difficult, confusing, messy emotional world that's out there outside of their emotion, their self-destructive, or I should say self-soothing, because that's ultimately what it is, behavior, that you can walk with them on that. They probably feel lonely. They probably feel like they can't take that step outside of that cycle, that vicious cycle of self-destruction, because who's going to be there with them? You get so used to it. So these are processes of habit change, I think, and we all have to afford each other a whole lot more grace when it comes to breaking or modifying these habits.
Thanks for sharing that. Your book's called So-Called Normal. What was the meaning of that title?
For most of my life, I wanted nothing more than just to be normal, just to be like everybody else, who I thought out all you people, whoever you are, listening or watching or whatever, all you people had it figured out. You all knew what you were doing, whether much of my intense struggle happened before social media, well before social media, but even still, we see this on social media all the time. People don't post pictures of themselves, I hope anyway, at the worst moments of their life, at funerals, or when they're the ugliest, or when I posted a video of myself when I searched for and actually reconnected with that stranger in the light brown jacket.
Oh, you guys ended up reconnecting?
Life. We reconnected because I asked for the public's help in finding him. I had no idea who this guy was. And one of my first instincts when I found him, he sent me a letter I recorded a video of myself, which I posted on YouTube, of just ugly crying as I read this letter from this stranger who saved my life. And it's like, these are the moments when we are our most real. Those are the moments that we actually connect with people, not when you've got this facade that you're presenting to everyone. Look how competent I am. Look how handsome I am. Look how smart I am. Whatever you think it is that gives you value, whatever suit that you're going to wear today, all of that stuff falls away when we are our most real and vulnerable, and that's where connection happens. So, when I think that when I shared that, that was the healing power of that moment for me, was that I didn't have to hide from any of this stuff anymore. So, I think that for me, to go back to the title of the book, I was operating under an illusion that I didn't know that you don't know that you're in the matrix when you're in it. You don't know the trip when you're on it, because when you're in it, when you're in it, you're in it. So for me to finally start to break out of that space and look around in a place of radical vulnerability, radical openness, and see that everybody else was suffering and struggling in their own ways, just like me, that all of that bill of goods that we've been sold about the good life, the perfect life, the American dream, whatever myth it is that you want to package it with, that it's all a lie, that there's so much more depth out there. I think that's when I realized that I could let go of that aspiration to be just like everybody else, to be normal. So I think that's where the title so-called normal came from for me. It was this idea that nobody's normal, and who would want to be?
Yeah, gross, right? Like, we're all just winging this thing anyways. There's no, I always say, the way
100%.
I put it is, there's no right way to do life. Like, you pick a path and you just kind of, I think the key is to try to just love the path that you choose, but there's no one way or right way to do this whole thing. And so, like you said, we're all just trying to walk each other home. Well, for people that want to follow you more. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, too, it turns out that we're all just making it up as we go. Yeah. And it's the first time that I've ever done this life, as far as I know. So give me a break here. It's my first day.
Well, you get older. There's that moment you get older and you realize your parents didn't know what they were doing. You're like, oh my gosh, they were winging it, you know, or your school teachers or like cops. And you're like, oh, they're all just trying the best they know how to, you know.
Or you have that transcendent moment where you find yourself in a circumstance that you remember your own parents being in or saying to you, and you realize, oh, now I got to figure this out too. And every now and then, I think we can learn from those past experiences and decide either to do it the same way because it was a great example, or hopefully to do it a little bit differently and better.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you and the role that you're playing. For people that want to follow you, learn more about these topics, get your book, where do we send them?
On most, if not all, social media platforms, at Mark Henick, at MarkHenick, on most of those platforms, Facebook, X, or Twitter, whatever you still call it, Instagram, LinkedIn. The book, so-called Normal, that's available on Amazon and at most other retailers worldwide. And I'm not hard to find. I do mental health in both my professional and personal life. So I'm constantly sharing things that I find either interesting or funny or curious or provocative on most of my social platforms. And I love it when people reach out and connect with me about that stuff.
Awesome. And the guy that saved your life, what was his name?
His name is Mike. He is one of my son's godfathers now. He's been working in crisis intervention with young boys ever since. Amazing. So it turns out we both impacted each other that night on that bridge.
Beautiful. Well, I'm glad that Mike was there and that you're here with us. So thank you again so much, Mark, and we will be in touch.
Thanks, Jimmy.